Have you ever noticed that everything starts falling into place precisely when you stop caring so much? It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Your entire life you've been taught to chase, to fight, to insist. But what if it's exactly the opposite? What if it's precisely our attachment that blocks us in our relationships, in our work, even in our inner peace? Carl Jung, one of psychology's greatest minds, championed an idea that few people are ready to hear. The harder you try to control life, the more it slips through your fingers. Today, I'll show you why letting go might be the only true path to freedom. Stay with me until the end, because this shift could change everything for you. The paradox of attachment. The more we cling to ideas about how things should be, the more they slip away from us. Attachment, which theoretically should bring us security, actually chains us to expectations that rarely come to pass. The paradox is clear. When we release control, life begins to breathe. Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms." We live in a culture that values effort, control, and the constant desire to achieve something, as if peace were always one step ahead of us. But this compulsive need to make everything work might be exactly what prevents something real from happening. This isn't about abandonment or apathy. It's about a more subtle movement, stepping out of the mode where we want to control everything and entering a state of self-awareness. The prison of projection. Carl Jung, in exploring the depths of the human psyche, gave us an important key to understanding this movement. For him, detachment wasn't an act of emotional coldness, but a necessary psychic gesture. The ego must detach from its projections so that something more authentic can emerge. In other words, as long as we're prisoners of what we project onto people, desires, idealized futures, we cannot see clearly what's really happening within us. It's natural to want things to work out, but the problem arises when our identity becomes tied to the outcome. When I am the success, the relationship, the recognition, then failure, loss, or another's silence become existential threats. This is where anxiety, fear, and the desperate attempt to keep everything under control are born. Jung said this state of permanent tension is nothing but the ego trying to maintain an illusion. What changes everything is the moment we stop fighting against life's current, not from defeat, but from clarity. Letting go isn't falling into a void. It's allowing something new to emerge, something that doesn't depend exclusively on our will. It's an act of trust in the higher intelligence that operates behind the experiences we live. When this gesture truly occurs, what seemed confusing begins to make sense. Puzzle pieces fall into place effortlessly. Opportunities appear without having to chase them. And what was anxiety becomes presence. The shadow behind our attachments. But what if this attachment that blocks us isn't really about the other person, but rather something we've projected onto them? Attachment is rarely solely directed toward another. Most often, it concerns something we've placed in them. We project onto others a form of salvation, validation, a role they didn't necessarily ask to play. Jung was clear in stating that what we refuse to see in ourselves, we tend to see in others, idealized or distorted. It's in this miscalibrated reflection that attachment forms. The ego, hungry for control and recognition, attempts to possess the external world as if it were an extension of itself. When we attach to a person, status, or goal, it's often not because it has absolute value, but because we project onto it something we lack. The desire to be loved, for example, can manifest as emotional dependence. The fear of being insignificant can appear as an obsession with success. What seems like love or ambition is often just an attempt to fill an inner void. These projections act like distorting lenses. Instead of seeing the other as they are, we see what we want them to be. And this is where frustration is born, because no one can indefinitely play a role that doesn't belong to them. When the ego collapses, there comes a moment when the attempt to sustain everything fails. The character created to meet expectations, demands, and norms begins to crumble. The strength that once seemed to come from control becomes a burden, and the fatigue that appeared merely physical reveals its true origin. The ego is exhausted. This fatigue isn't laziness or weakness. It's a silent cry from the unconscious, a forced pause, as if something inside were saying, "I can no longer pretend." And it's precisely here that the self begins to manifest, not in euphoria, but in that strange peace that's born when something ends. Jung saw these collapses as calls to truth. When inner life becomes disorganized, it's often because it's about to reorganize at another level. The emotional burnout so common today can be seen not only as an excess of stimulation, but as an excess of persona. Too many roles, too many expectations, not enough coherence with what we actually feel. Living to maintain an image demands constant energy. We must weigh our words, emotions, reactions, always be in control. But when the body gives out, when the mind blocks, when will fades, a question emerges. Who are you without all of this? The death of what never was. We talk a lot about detachment as liberation, but rarely about the pain it involves, because letting go is also a form of death, not physical, but symbolic, and sometimes just as intense. Detaching from an idea, a relationship, a projected future means grieving what didn't come to pass. And this grief is very real. Jung understood suffering not as an error to eradicate, but as an essential process of transformation. Without death, there is no rebirth, he said, and this applies as much to external cycles as internal ones. When something must leave, a plan that fails, a love that fades, an identity that no longer holds, there's a rupture. And every rupture, even necessary ones, hurts. In this context, detaching isn't a cold, rational choice. It's a deep emotional process that often leads us toward places of silence, doubt, vulnerability. There's a void that opens when what we relied upon ceases to exist. And even if this void is fertile, at first, it frightens. The creative space that opens. When what bound us finally comes undone, something curious happens. The world doesn't collapse. Instead, it reorganizes. The silence that seemed threatening becomes fertile. The void that frightened reveals itself to be space. And it's in this space that things begin to germinate. Things that couldn't be born while everything was occupied by control, expectations, and noise. It's like opening a window after years with shutters closed. Dust dances in the light, the air changes. At first, it's strange, a kind of peaceful discomfort. But gradually, breathing returns, and with it, presence. The mind stops running and finally begins to listen, listening to the body, to time, to life's subtle signs. Imagine someone who spent years in a relationship where there was no real exchange anymore, but they clung on through fear, attachment, habit. When they finally let go, not just of the other person, but of the illusion that it had to continue, shock occurs. Empty silence, but soon, a secret space. And in this space, they begin writing again, cooking without obligation, feeling the urge to go out alone, to listen to music in the dark, to do something without having to show it to anyone. This is creativity returning, not as a task, but as expression. The self takes center stage. Jung spoke of psychic energy that's released when we stop feeding the ego's defense mechanisms. All this energy that was invested in maintaining a persona, controlling the future, or resisting the present is now available. And this energy must go somewhere. This is where creation is born, not just artistic, but existential. Creating isn't just painting a picture or writing a poem. It's reorganizing your own life with presence. It's redoing your home, changing your route, choosing work that respects your rhythm. It's transforming lived suffering into concrete wisdom. Creating is when you stop reacting and begin choosing consciously. And this is only possible when there's space. This space is also where intuition finds its voice again. Once suffocated by the noise of expectations and anxiety, it now expresses itself more clearly. You begin to perceive connections where you once saw only problems. An idea emerges in the shower. An answer appears without effort. After days of forcing, you stop thinking to find and begin feeling to perceive. Time changes too. The day no longer resembles a battlefield. You slow down, not from laziness, but from alignment. Decisions become lighter because you're no longer trying to prove anything. And curiously, the things that seemed inaccessible before begin coming to you, not through magic, but because you've finally gotten out of your own way. Think of an artist with creative block, someone who puts so much pressure on themselves to produce something brilliant that they can no longer create anything. Until the day, exhausted, they let go. They set the project aside, allow themselves to rest, go for a walk, leave without an agenda. And there, in the middle of nowhere, a new idea is born, spontaneous, alive, without pressure. This is the power of detachment. When you let go, what is true returns or finally finds the space to be born. This state of free creation, of connection to the self, is the opposite of the ego's logic. The ego wants control, guarantees, performance. The self seeks expression, truth, harmony. When the ego steps away from center stage, the self takes over with lightness. It doesn't demand, it guides. It suggests paths but never constrains. It manifests through what you take pleasure in doing, even if no one is watching, even if it serves no purpose. This is where detachment reveals its most beautiful face. It's not just loss, it's transition. A bridge between what was and what can still emerge, between who you were when you needed to prove something and who you are when you only need to be present. The true freedom of non-attachment. At its core, everything comes down to a silent gesture, opening the hand, releasing control, images, fears, repeated stories, not from fatigue, though fatigue is sometimes the beginning, but from clarity. Because there comes a moment when the effort to hold on costs more than the loss itself. Attachment, however familiar, is not love. It is fear, lack, an attempt to keep alive something that may have already fulfilled its mission. To love is to let the other exist, to let experience unfold, to let life follow its course even when it doesn't match our expectations. Control, meanwhile, is not a sign of strength. It's a subtler form of resistance. It's the ego trying to force reality to bend to its desires. But living according to this logic means remaining in constant tension, at war with the present. And no soul can endure this for very long. Jung reminds us that healing doesn't occur when we force change, but when we accept what is, when we stop fighting against life and begin listening to it. When we stop chasing what should be and look honestly at what's already here. Acceptance isn't resignation, it's openness. It's the door through which true transformation enters. The final question. So perhaps the most important question now is this. What are you still holding on to? What image, what story, what person, what expectation still occupies space within you and prevents the new from entering? What could finally breathe if you let it go? Letting go is a risk, but so is holding on. And often the risk of remaining imprisoned is greater than the fear of change, because we're not here to play roles. We're here to live. And living truly requires courage, the courage to shed the layers that no longer serve, the courage to draw closer to the essential, the courage to allow yourself to be. Life begins when the illusion of control ends, and it's at that moment, almost always silent and intimate, that we return to ourselves, not as an ideal, but as presence. And from there, everything that truly matters finds its way. The space that opens after letting go isn't a void to fear. It's fertile ground awaiting your true presence. There, life doesn't shout, it whispers. And you, more attentive, purer inside, begin to hear. If this content resonated with you, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel. Activate notifications to continue receiving reflections like this on detachment, consciousness, self-knowledge, and Jung's depth psychology applied to real life. And if you stayed until here, write in the comments, "I release what no longer belongs to me." That way I'll know you walked with me to the end, and that somehow this video touched you.